It's been said by many different people, the two most important decisions that you make is to follow Christ and whom you marry. And the second one has a lot of determination on the first decision, and if you do it and how well you keep it. In Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, we have an interesting scripture. It says there, it came about in time that the men began to multiply on the face of the land, and the daughters were born to them. That the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they choose. Here we see the intermarriage of the sons of God and the daughters of men. It's one of those passages, sometimes the harder we try to make out what it's saying, the less sense that it does make. What we see here are two groups that are deciding to marry one another. But who are these groups and what context does it have? You see, really the kicker, the difficulty of this passage comes a couple verses later in verse 4, when in essence it repeats much of the same thing, but adds a twist. In verse 4 of Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4, it says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." You see here, there's an interesting term that's used there, the Nephilim. The Nephilim is a word that we transliterate, which means we take the sounds of the original word and make a new word in our language. Usually you do that when you have difficulty translating terminology. And here the word has come to mean a giant, someone of giant stature. We see that used in Numbers chapter 13 in verses 32 through 33. Here it describes those that were going into the promised land, the spies that were there, looking at the people and saw that they were men of great size. And there were also the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, or part of Nephilim. And they became like grasshoppers in our sight, and so we were in their sight. You see, the people fear because they say these men are giants. They're men of great stature. And they tremble in fear because there's no way they could defeat people like that. So what exactly are these men, and what does that have to do with the sons of God and the sons of men? The term that's used here, that we use for Nephilim, comes from a root word which means to fall. Nephilim is the root word is to fall. So it could be described as the fallen. Where some have looked at that and said that this must be referring to angels. Angels that had fallen. And these sons of God would have married into the line of men. And in doing so, produced children of great size. Children that would have been renowned because they were somehow given the special traits that came from their angelic size. This is the popular Jewish interpretation of this idea, and you'll find several commentaries and several people that make this the explanation for the verse. But there's a problem with that, and it's a rather big problem. Because Jesus says in Matthew chapter 22 in verse 30, when he's talking about the resurrection, that in the resurrection there will be no marriage. People will not marry or are given in marriage, but they are like angels in heaven. The contrast there being is that angels do not marry or are given in marriage. And so the idea that angels would be able to marry and to procreate would seem to be at odds with some truth that Jesus told us. In fact, the Hebrew writer uses that same idea of angels not begetting or being begotten as a point to show the significance, the uniqueness of Jesus in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5. To whom of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? And again I will say, "I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me." You see, Jesus, because of Him being the only begotten Son, stands unique. And angels don't seem to operate in that way. Gender here is seen as a physical identity, not a supernatural, spiritual one. And so the idea that these beings could be somehow the hybrids of angels and men seems to go against the principles laid out in Scripture. So how do we figure out who in the world is being talked about here? Well, so oftentimes the way you find out what something means is to put it in context. Context is often the verse before and the verse after. If you look at verse 4 in Genesis chapter 3, you see this description. But the previous verse is in verse 3 that talks about how God was not going to live with man forever. That He was going to put a limit on the age of man. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. That God, being fed up with mankind and his wickedness, decided to put a top limit on the age of man before he would die. Verse 5 shows us that God is becoming more concerned with mankind because the wickedness of man was great, and that every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. You see, between those two verses, we see that mankind is expanding. There's more of him. There's an intermarriage that's taking place between the sons of God and the daughters of men. And what it's causing is man to become more and more wicked. You see, here it talks about that the men that were raised at that time were men of renown. They made a name for themselves, literally. They were people that did things that made people recognize them. But you can do great things and still be evil. You can do things that were highly useful to the society, but yet you were apart from God. You know that phrase, making a name for themselves, shows up again a little bit later in Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. Why did man decide to build the Tower of Babel? Well, verse 4 tells us they did it to make a name for themselves. Let us build a city, a tower on top that will reach the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. But see, God had commanded that. At the end of the flood, He commands mankind to go and repopulate the earth, to spread out. But mankind didn't do what they were told. And they came together and decided, let's make a name for ourselves. You see, the men of old were men that made a name for themselves, but that doesn't mean they were doing so in the will of God. You know, last week we talked about the line of Cain and the descendants of Cain, and how we noticed that they were brilliant. They created metalworking. They created art and music. They were doing all kinds of things, but we also see they were moving farther away from God's plan for them. So what does this have to do with the sons of God and the daughters of men? Well, what we have here is not a supernatural difficulty, some kind of conundrum that we can't figure out, but rather it's a story that has been going on throughout the ages. An age-old story of what happens when the people of God unite themselves with the people of the world. When men of earth and men of God come together. When the fleshly and the spiritual intermingle. What happens is it doesn't bring man up, but usually brings him down. You see, this intermarriage was something that we see throughout the rest of the Scripture being a great difficulty for people who are attempting to follow God's will. You know, oftentimes we hear that phrase intermarriage, we think of a racial identity. But when the Bible speaks of intermarriage, it's not talking about race as much as it's talking about culture, and more importantly, it's talking about religion, about belief and faith. When people that follow God decide to intermarry with those who have moved away from God, the sons of men, the sons of God, and the daughters of men is just another way to describe godly people choosing mates that weren't godly. It's what God warned the people of Israel about in Exodus chapter 34 and verse 16. When they get to the promised land, you might take some daughters for your sons, and the daughters will play the harlot with their gods, and cause your sons also to play the harlot with their gods. Here God is forbidding them, don't go into this promised land and let your sons marry their daughters. Don't take your godly sons and say, well, here's a woman that you can take as your wife, because what is she going to do? She's going to have him play the harlot with the gods of that place. You will abandon God. You'll cheat on God with these other gods. And the next thing you know, your sons will be worshiping those gods. It's the same thing that Nehemiah rails against. That ends up pulling people's hair out over in Nehemiah chapter 13 in verses 23 through 27. When Nehemiah, who had done so much for the people of Israel, he had rebuilt their wall, he had reestablished them as a city of Jerusalem. He brought the people back to the law, but he comes back and what does he find? He says he finds that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And as for their children, half spoke the language of Ashdod, but none of them were able to speak in the language of Judah, but in the language of his own people. So it says that he contends with those people. He physically attacks some of them and says, what have you done? In verse 26, he says, did not Solomon the king of Israel sin in regard to these things? You should know better. This is what got us in the problem in the first place. When Solomon married foreign wives and they brought him down, he continues that yet among the many nations there was no king like him. He was loved by God, and God made him king over all of Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused him to act to sin. Do we then hear about you, that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God, by marrying foreign women? Why is Nehemiah so upset? He said, you're doing what King Solomon did. A man who had great position, but he chose to marry those women of other religions, and they brought their gods to him. And because of the nature of marriage, he compromised. And that compromise pulled him away from God. And the same thing is going to happen to you because you're following in the same path. But don't just think that this is an Old Testament thing. Oh, that was just for the old law. The same warnings are given in the New Testament. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 15 tells us, do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership does righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Or what harmony has Christ with Baal? Or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? You see, if a son of God begins to intermingle, to intermarry, to be with those who are the daughters of men, who live according to worldly principles, usually the pull is only in one way. Of course, this can be a very difficult situation. This can be an extremely difficult one to talk about. Why? Because it sounds like we're telling people who they can and can't love, who they can and can't be with. Who are you, preacher? Who are you, minister, to tell people that? Well, you see, God is giving a warning. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Of course, in that situation, you have those who had come to Christ, that were already married. Some that had become believers when their spouses haven't. Some of them who were already set to be married, dealing with the situation. What could you do if you found yourself in this state? We know that it's not the optimum state. So what's a Christian to do? Paul talks about that issue in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 12 when he says, to the rest I say, not the Lord, but if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, if he consents to live with her, he must not send her husband away. You see, here he's trying to explain to them the principles that the Lord has laid down when it comes to marriage and divorce and remarriage. And he quotes the same scriptures that Jesus quoted when he quoted from the beginning. He made them male and female. But he begins to deal with specific situations, and he gives advice on that. What if you're a married man and you come to be a Christian and your wife's not? Does that mean you have to separate? Does that mean you have to divorce her? Paul says no. No, and there's a reason that he gives in verse 16. How do you not know, O wife, that you will save your husband? Or how do you not know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? I could tell you stories of women who converted their husbands, who weren't a Christian when they were married, and later on they brought them to Christ. I can tell you husbands that did the same. But I can tell you other stories of people who weren't able to, and difficulties that they had. Here it's not giving a grounds for divorce, but rather saying if the person will live with them, you need to commit your commitment of marriage. But in verses 15 and 16 he says if they don't, if the unbelieving one leaves, let them leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such case. God has called us to peace. What is Paul saying here? He's saying you don't have to follow your spouse out of the church. Your spouse refuses to leave. You can't force them to stay with you. But that doesn't mean you leave your Lord. Doesn't mean that they're free then to out of the marriage. Paul will discuss that later. But the principle, the understanding here is Paul understands that there's a great difficulty that can be found when a husband and a wife are not on the same page spiritually. Reminds me of the old cartoon where the husband was being unfaithful to his church, and the wife told him, she said, don't make me choose between my husband and my God, because the truth of the matter is you fall a lot short. Husband, you're not going to be God. You're going to always be short. But you see, Paul here is trying to emphasize something. Later, as he talks to another situation of widows who would find themselves with a husband that has passed, who would then be free to remarry. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39, he says they are free to marry whom they wishes, but only in the Lord. What is he telling these ones? The next chance you get, find somebody who is in the Lord. Marry someone who is a member of the church. You see, there are a lot of choices you don't get a redo on. And marriage is one of them. So you need to do it right. And it needs to be a great consideration for those who are considering marriage of the spiritual nature and how that marriage will affect it. Because we have a commitment to our Lord, and a spouse can bring great harm to it or great help. You've heard me preaching over the last 6 years. You probably know I'm a big fan of Abraham Lincoln. I talk a lot about Abraham Lincoln. I use him in a lot of illustrations about him. As much as I like Abraham Lincoln, I do not like Mary Todd Lincoln. Mary Todd Lincoln was the wife of Abraham Lincoln. Historians have started to back off over the years of their criticism of Mary Todd Lincoln. I haven't joined them yet. When you read the stories about Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln, he married her after a woman that he was courting passed away. And she was from a rather predominant family. It would have been good. It was good for his career, but she was always a little bit full of herself. And Lincoln, who was a man of great care and concern, loved his wife. But she didn't help him. She was selfish. When he truly needed her was when she was at her worst. When she was in the White House, she ran up a huge debt. Of course, when she came into the White House was in disrepair, and things needed to be taken care of because the White House was frankly in terrible shape at that time. But Mary Todd just spent and spent and spent. And doing so, she obliged her husband debts that he couldn't pay. When they lost their son in the White House, she blamed Abraham Lincoln. And in his grief, he had to somehow go to, his wife should be there to support one another. She she turned on him. After Lincoln would die, she would be a burden to his sons. Eventually, she'd be committed to a sanitarium because of her strange actions. Lincoln was known for having a strong sense of melancholy. We would call it depression today. And I think a lot of it was rooted in how his spouse treated him and how they lived. If a great man like Lincoln could have great difficulty because of his spouse, if a great king like Solomon could fail God because of his spouse, if people of high renown and high will and strength of character could suffer, then you and I could suffer as well. That's why it's very important that we consider who we marry and the state of our marriage. Some of you may be thinking, well, I've already chosen my spouse. Too late for that. But you know, your marriage is something that helps determine your relationship to God. Paul starts that out in 1 Corinthians 7. That can affect your prayer life. It can affect many other things. And it's very important that we consider how we treat our spouse and how we act to them. You know, Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 24 through 26, that marriage is akin to Jesus and the church. He says, but as the church is subject to Christ, so the wives must be to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. Wives, before you find a husband, you need to make sure he's worth submitting to, because you will be commanded to do just that. Husbands, you better understand that woman that you are choosing, you're going to have to give up your life for, because that's exactly what God requires of you. We look at how Christ treats His bride, the church, and how the church is to be to Him, and that is the high example that God gives us. And what God has joined together should be kept that way. Notice Jesus said from the beginning, and what God has joined together, let not man separate. You see, God has a say-so in who we marry. And this lesson really can be expanded upon. We've focused on marriage, but it can be expanded further. It's a lesson for all of us, whether we're married or not, whether we're considering marriage or not, whether we're past that or not. Because it's about that principle of how we unite ourselves with others. It can be taken to our friendships, our business relationships. Are we, the sons of God, allowing the daughters of a world of men to pull us down? Are we following because, as they said, well, it looked good? They saw the daughters of men and it looked good. Like Samson, oh, she looks good to me. Looks aren't everything. Are we seeking only for our own name, and in the end ending up in ruin? If the people of God want to stay the people of God, they must make decisions that help them along that path. And who we choose to associate and be around, who we choose to allow ourselves with, will determine that. We need to be very careful about our friends, very careful about our spouses, very careful where we find ourselves. You know, I've always said that the people that I most want to be around are the people who are God's people. So when they're together, I want to be with them. What does it say when we don't want to be around the people of God when they gather together? Maybe it's because we're surrounding ourselves with the wrong people. You see, to be a son of God, it requires us to put our faith in the Son of God, to confess Him as Lord, to turn away from the sin that brings us into ruin, and to be united with Christ. As we're baptized into Christ, we are added to His church, the bride of Christ. As a husband and a wife marry, Christ takes on His bride, the church. We want to be a part of that relationship, that most important relationship. It requires us to give ourselves to Him. Are we finding ourselves unfaithful in that relationship? Notice how many times when God compares that to marriage, they're being unfaithful. They're playing the harlot. Why? Because they're going off and with someone else. They're fooling around with the world. Are we cheating on God with the things of this world, or are we remaining faithful to Him? Today, if you haven't put on Christ in baptism, or maybe you're not living faithfully to God, it's time for a change. Maybe there's something that you need to confess today, or maybe there's a decision that you need to make. If there's any way that we can help you do that, why don't you respond to the invitation? Take the chance to put on Christ. We offer it to you now while we stand and while we sing.
In the cold, He will bear you gently to His fold. See Him sole and open I implore. Why keep Jesus waiting?